So why was the concept of Sonojoi so influential during this time period? It's because the imperial court more and more was becoming seen as a center of opposition to the foreigners, but also as a center of opposition to the Bakufu. The perception amongst many samurai became that the Bakufu were just completely incapable of protecting the interests of the emperor, and thus they kind of had to step out of the way. Their power had to be destroyed. It took a while for even the radical samurai to come to this kind of decision. Basically, what we have to keep in mind is that this concept of Sonojoi was in many ways an expression of earlier political thought. Do you remember a few lectures back when we were talking about the new intellectual trends in Tokugawa Japan, and I mentioned nativist scholarship, Kokugaku? Well, a branch of that kind of examination was something which came to be known as Mito learning, Mitogaku, centered in the province of Mito, that far northeastern province to the northeast of Tokyo. Today it's actually Fukushima. It's where the part of it is Fukushima. It's where the nuclear accident was. But basically, this was a part of nativist learning that was that took root and was nurtured in that domain. Like most nativist scholars, Mito scholars believed that Japan should kind of reinvent itself. Well, not really reinvent itself. Japan should go back to its native roots because it was a country that had been ruled by the same emperor for thousands of years, and these people were divine, and that made Japan unique and special. It was kind of one of the well springs of Japanese nationalism. You can really interpret it in that way. But one of the chief tenets of Mitogaku had been that the emperor is certainly the ruler, the font of all political authority, and Mitogaku spelled out very clearly that the Tokugawa shoguns were the protectors of the emperor's interest. Well, when things started to deteriorate, especially during the Bakumatsu period, the very late Edo period, some Mito scholars came to the conclusion that the Tokugawa had to be overthrown precisely because of what I was talking about earlier, because they were no longer capable of serving the best interests of the emperor. They were just not up to the job. Mito domain was very special, though, if you'll remember. It was a Tokugawa house domain. The daimyo who ruled it, his name was Tokugawa. Especially the last daimyo, Tokugawa Nariaki, a very famous, very kind of a fiery proponent of this nativist scholarship, and somebody who was motivated to take political steps in following it. Just because he happened to come from a junior branch of the Tokugawa family doesn't mean that he was above asserting his own authority and in effect raising a rebellion. This is what happened. He, as the daimyo of his domain, he was making a lot of trouble. The Tokugawa, I believe, had placed him under confinement. He wasn't about to have any of that. He actually tried to gather his supporters to him and basically challenge the Edo shogunate. Some other people in his domain opposed him. Other domain troops got involved. The shogunate sent in its own forces. And in 1868, there was basically a civil war in Mito domain. and the daimyo Tokugawa Nariaki, he was defeated and he was kind of marginalized, he was sidelined. But this idea that first really exploded in Mito had by now taken deep roots elsewhere, in part in Choshu Prefecture. That same one that we just finished talking about, although we're certainly not finished talking about. It plays a very important role down to the end of this course. So as the Tokugawa and the imperial court were increasingly perceived to be on opposite sides of basically some of the most important issues in the realm, how to deal with these foreigners, and were perceived as increasingly as enemies, samurai within the various domains took sides. There were pro-Bakufu samurai even in the outside domains, absolutely. People who saw it in the interest of their domains to not piss the Tokugawa off. And there were others, both gradual reformists who wanted to adopt Western technology, etc., to challenge the Tokugawa, and radicals who wanted to overthrow the Tokugawa now and kill the foreigners now. All of these kinds of factions began to vie for control of these governments, and in some cases they did gain control. In many cases, these factions were very much these radicals, these anti-Tokugawa factions, in many cases they were very much on the outside of political developments within their domains, and many of these men instead did what I had alluded to earlier. They went to the big cities and they formed essentially terrorist cells. In Kyoto, in Edo, in Kyoto, the Tokugawa took a very interesting step of founding essentially a special police unit, the famous, the legendary Shinsengumi, this newly created group, which used political assassination itself, kind of turning the tactics of these men upon themselves. And these anti-Tokugawa radicals, they called themselves Shishi, which means men of high purpose. And they were very often these kind of scruff, young samurai, especially young samurai. There were some older firebrands, including Tokugawa Nariaki himself, but really the younger generation, and especially the younger samurai from the less well-to-do samurai families, from people who were suffering under the economic privations of living in the late Tokugawa period. As I mentioned, many samurai were desperately poor, and these younger representatives of that generation were very much disaffected and thought it would be a great idea to go murder Tokugawa officials and their allies. And this situation was something which the Tokugawa couldn't really control. It became a game of whack-a-mole, so to speak. You know, there's a rebellion in Mito in 1864. Oh, okay, great, fine, we're going to put it down. Oh no, terrorism is up in Kyoto, so they move troops to Kyoto. Nothing seems to work. They appoint the daimyo of Aizu domain to oversee Kyoto. He cracks down on the radicals, and the radicals radical activity is diminished for a second, but then it comes out in some other way. And so the Tokugawa are kind of at a loss. Nevertheless, it wasn't... I don't really think that anything in history is necessarily inevitable, and certainly the collapse of this or that regime I don't think is really inevitable. I think in hindsight it looks as if the Tokugawa were doomed, certainly, but please try to put yourself in the shoes of people living in Japan at the time, and we see that this really wasn't something that was necessarily obvious, because the Bakufu did have some strengths to draw on. First of all, there was something that was approaching a strong national consciousness. as we've seen in many ways in the concluding of stable borders, in the interactions between Japanese and Ainu, certainly in the interactions between Japanese and foreigners after the unequal treaties have been signed. There is a sense that there is a larger unit here called Japan, and it is it's something that binds people across the archipelago and across social status groups. That is something that was certainly not to be taken for granted. It's a great source of strength for a government. There was also this high literacy rate. By some estimates, and estimates is all we really have, but by some estimates it was astonishingly high. 80% of people in Edo, according to some, were literate. And if you think about what the figures for European cities were and American cities were, they were I mean, I can't really, I don't really remember any figures off the top of my head, but whenever I am in conversation with other historians of this subject, or read something in the literature, it just basically says, yeah, Japan had a much higher literacy rate overall than many of these supposedly civilized and advanced Western countries, and that's very important as well. Commercialized economy. This was something that the samurai had not been able to adapt to that well. They were great consumers of this commercialized economy. They didn't produce terribly much. But overall, in Japan, there was this great source of tax revenue and just this economic activity going on that the state could potentially draw on. There were strong and established patterns of social civility. This was a place where the rules of conduct were indeed, had indeed evolved in a way that they were successful at mitigating many of the stresses of Japanese society. Remember our discussions of how, it was legal to kill your wife for being lazy or bad, but hardly any samurai did so. Why not? Well, because that's just not how it was done in the Edo period. Many of these violent impulses of the samurai and, well, not just of the samurai, but certainly of the warrior class, had been controlled, more or less, not perfectly. But there was a kind of a civil a civil attitude towards people, not exactly a concept of rights, but an understanding that you can't just go around and do what you want, and also civil society. When you combine these rules of conduct with the explosion of a commercialized economy and arts and free associations between people and even among people of different social classes, you get the sense that there really is emerging here a very complex kind of almost a modern society where people who don't necessarily know each other think of themselves as having a lot in common, reading the same kinds of books. That is very important for creating a country. A strong bureaucracy. People are quick to criticize the Tokugawa bureaucracy, or let's put it this way: it's easy to criticize Tokugawa bureaucracy, and many histories written in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s do take this tack, saying that the bureaucracy was completely inefficient, and that there were many instances in which it was inefficient and incapable of dealing with severe crises like famine, for example. But more recently, actually, there has been a re-examination of this question, and the Tokugawa bureaucracy is emerging more and more as an institution which was as efficient as possible given the constraints of the time. given the fact that they were perpetually short of money, given the fact that there were clearly more samurai than was strictly necessary to fill all of these positions. The Tokugawa bureaucracy and the various domain bureaucracies that also functioned in this system, the people who staffed them were very well aware of their imperfections, aware of the places in which it was not efficient, and they did what bureaucrats in all settings do, is they developed relationships amongst each other which let the system function nonetheless, created workarounds, created working relationships, and had a sense of professionalism and a dedication to their duty, which is not to be sneezed at. That's a really big deal. And that is certainly more than we can say for the bureaucracy of a great many places. One tends to think of places like Russia in the 1990s, and of course, today, in many ways, to see what happens to a country when its bureaucratic class kind of lacks a sense of responsibility and professionalism. In Tokugawa Japan, that does not seem to have been the case. People disagreed, people were willing to kill each other over their disagreements more and more, but people involved in the government of Japan, the samurai, whether on the domain level or the Bakufu level, were in... yeah, sure, there's Katsukokichi everywhere, but by and large, people like Katsukokichi, but by and large these were conscientious individuals who were clear about their tasks and the challenges that faced them. And there were people like Inosuke, this, as we've seen, very hard-nosed, uncompromising bureaucrat who was able, for a time, to put together a coherent package of reforms and government initiatives and do his best to implement them. Nevertheless, there were factors which we can now really talk about as causes for the restoration, and some of these I've talked about before, so this slide need not detain us for too long. But some domains, especially Choshu, Satsuma, but also domains like Tosa, Hizen, and Mito, basically ended up in the opposing camp from the Tokugawa by various means at various times, but all of these domains went on to challenge the Tokugawa, and though domain opposition just was only one of the factors that led into the restoration, eventually the enemies of the Tokugawa organized into military groups, and of course these groups were organized according to the government of the domains that supported the cause of the imperial family against the Tokugawa. So naturally domains became rallying points for opposition. They funded the opposition. It did have, the restoration did, have a lot of the trappings of coalitions of samurai domains coming together against the center. The outside finally coming together against the Tokugawa center. Of course, these long-term fiscal and political crises, just the sense that the times had worsened, there was a pervasive sense of that in the countryside and in the cities as well. And of course, the actions of Westerners did a lot to unsettle the situation. We see this sense that the times were getting worse and increasing social unrest. And I want to give an example of a very specific kind of phenomenon that took place during the Bakumatsu period, which was called the Eijanaika. Literally translated, it means, isn't this great? Or, it's fine, isn't it? Or even, just let it go. Something like that. What this was a series of spontaneous happenings, kind of, that took place all over Japan, but especially concentrated in the areas where the rural crisis was greatest. And it was basically a happening, like I said, where people spontaneously started dancing, saying, "Hey, Janaika, isn't it great?" Breaking into the houses of rich people, helping themselves, and generally the tight-laced social order of the Tokugawa period was, for a time, dissolved in a bit. The kind of, in a way, a kind of dissolved into chaos, as all of these peasants just started this manic demonstration of essentially spontaneous disobedience. And this was there were supposedly signs from heaven that foretold great change, and this kind of event tended to spread from village to village. As people heard what was happening, they're like, "Well, Eijanaika," started dancing and taking off their clothes in some cases. So this was something. It's a very interesting kind of phenomenon. In some ways, it's hard to pin down, but it certainly, I think, does show us that any small degree of a loss of control by the government could really boil out into loss of social cohesion in a way, which was even more worrying. I think the Bakufu itself was also a cause of the restoration in a way, because even though there were periods of clarity and purpose where people like Inaosuke did dominate politics, and people like Abe Masahiro were also capable people. And the Bakufu did have a lot going for it, but basically what ended up happening is that Bakufu officials who did have power set themselves up an impossible task. They tried to split, go through the eye of the needle, which is to say they tried to take a middle course where they would not antagonize the Westerners too much, but at the same time not give the Westerners everything they wanted, which was to basically turn Japan into a copy of China and kind of almost to break it up and colonize it. In many cases, we do see this as an aim through Western documents of the time. And at the same time, they tried to keep these radicals at bay, but also talk tough to the Westerners and try to reach even a rapprochement with the imperial court. And eventually, they didn't end up pleasing anybody. The Tokugawa didn't please the conservatives, who wanted to deal with the solution by just clamping down on the radical activists, all of these terrorists, and just do whatever they wanted with the foreigners, which essentially meant signing and upholding these unequal treaties. There were also people within the Bakufu who wanted to take a much harder line towards these foreigners. There was never a coherent policy set in place for long enough that had the backing of any substantial factor of the samurai establishment. Tokugawa never succeeded in putting together a truly popular program. The radical elements, as we've already talked about, these shishi, they were a cause, but really the main cause of this restoration was that all of these sub-causes kind of came together at the same time, at the same moment in time, this Bakumatsu period, 1850s and 1860s, and by coming together they kind of formed a new sun of discontent, which ended up just melting down the Tokugawa regime.